So basically, blah, blah. Why aren't developers very good at testing APIs? Basically, the devs doing QA aren't great because they're expensive. They don't want to break the API. They want to make sure the API works if it's not used by an idiot. And that's like verbatim what developer says. Like, well, if he's not an idiot, it's going to work. Well, you got to prepare for idiots. Like, we're all dummies according to like ourselves. Like, everyone thinks everyone else is a dummy. That's just the thought process of like culture in general. And then the reality is they're just not trying to break it as much as someone else is. But so why is it with websites and with apps we have a QA team? Why isn't the QA team in charge of testing APIs? And that's the part that we thought just doesn't make sense. And then finally, the other issue is stakeholders. So imagine like you're an API evangelist at Getty Images. You're in charge of answering questions from your customers like, hey, was the API down yesterday? I had no goddamn idea. Literally no idea. I would email the dev and he'd be like, I don't know, how am I supposed to know? It's like, no idea. That's why I asked you. Like, this was the situation we were in where only our developers could possibly have an idea. Like, there should be a status page about this stuff. Like, this sort of information you have as like a project manager, product manager of the website or the app is the same situation you should have there. So long story short, we came up with this idea. We asked a bunch of people, and we found out that like only about 5% of APIs were tested properly. And so we knew two things. We knew that like it was going to be a thing, and there wasn't a solution. There was one solution, and there needed to be disrupted. So that's what we did. So in 2015, we joined the ERA Accelerator in New York. Who here has heard of ERA? Cool, so a few people. So we were in the 2015 Session 8 class, graduated, raised money, and very specifically like went stealth for two reasons. The one is we had to build product. The second is we didn't want to waste all our money while we're building product. Had to stay quiet and not spend money on like salespeople. And actually, there's going to be a third reason, is just the timing. And what do we mean by timing? Well, this is actually the dullest thing you will ever learn, but you will learn something today. Like the automated testing market, basically after 5 to 6 years is when automated testing becomes a big thing after the technology gets really big. And so our guess was that we thought APIs really blew up in 2012. So our guess was that we had to exist until 2017 and have the product by then. So that's why we went stealth and just focused on it and just built it until the end of 2016, where we really, really opened up the doors. And then in 2017, we've been selling, and just closed a deal yesterday with eBay. So like we sort of got it right, and we're sort of pushing in that regard. So before I just dive into the product demo, quick question: who here has like made an API call with Postman or curl in the last like 3 weeks? All right, that's not bad, but let me do this. This is usually how I start, just a little bit easier. So like, everyone should know what an API is. So everyone here has heard of or used Uber until they protested it, because it's a mess. So like, we've all heard of Uber, used Uber. So Uber, like if you're actually using the app, it has 3 major endpoints. So an API is just like a vague term for the whole thing, but like 3 endpoints is like, what's available, how much will it cost, and let me request it. So those are 3 major endpoints for Uber. And so when you make the request, it's actually a very simple HTTP call. Like you call a website. It's actually remedial. This looks like a mess. When you actually break it down, it's just a URL, the API key, which is just a login, and then the latitude and longitude where you are right now. That's the whole thing. And if you make that call in Chrome, it just looks like this. Literally just tells you this information. So how does an API break? People are like, it either goes up or down. No, this stuff isn't right all the time. Like the images break. The data types are wrong. Sometimes Uber adds new things like Uber Eats. They threw in Uber Eats before warning anyone. So everyone that was like a partner of Uber would have this new type of product that didn't have an image associated with it, and it would crash the app. Like you have to warn people about new things. Otherwise it confuses like your app and it could be a problem. So that's specifically the sort of problems that occur and that people aren't testing for. And so what I'm going to do is actually show you API Fortress. And I'll be pretty quick with it because honestly, most of you don't need to use it. This will bore you to death, but I find it interesting. And so what's interesting is that we can all actually do this ourselves. So this is API Fortress. 3 major components are you build the test, you run the test, and how exactly do you get those notifications and data. So building the test, we made it as simple as possible. So if you can make the Uber API, the Uber call, which is what it is here, then you click on Magic. So the big differentiator for us is that we actually built the rules into the platform. So very specifically, the test is generated for you. And it's not just, you are the worst. I don't like you, but I could fix you. Did I fix you? Is it working? Perfect. All right, close enough. Cool. So very specifically, I loaded up So I use this HTTP client. I loaded up the API call there, and I clicked on the button called Magic. And then what Magic did is it actually went from a blank screen, it then filled it up with this. And so this is our API test. And it's doing more than just validating the schema, the layout. We're actually validating like a status is 200, which means A-OK, like validating data types, sort of really going through it. And there's more stuff you can do. You can do positive and negative testing and like create a full integration test with multi-steps. Again, if you want to learn that stuff, we could talk about it later. We could, in the future, you can go to the website and create your own account. I won't dive into that, but that's basically how you create a test. And as you saw, it just took a few minutes. Using SOAP UI or doing it by hand, you really just got to write a bunch of JavaScript. So you could be here for a few hours when we built it in under 1 minute. So then we're done. We actually built a test. So where do we go from here? Well, when do you want to run a test? You could run a test manually. So literally just going to the list of tests and you just click a button. That's just a quick smoke screen. That's the way most people were testing. Still today, the majority of people are just doing a quick smoke test before launching it, and they think everything's good to go. That's great, but that's just while you're developing. You need to go beyond that. So the other ways you can run a test are during your deployments automatically. Very specifically, we have a Jenkins plugin, and we have APIs and webhooks. So while you're developing, you run it manually. Then when it deploys, it automatically runs and then tells you if there's a failure. Great. And then finally, you could run the test by actually just scheduling it. Like, why can't you just set it up to say, like, you know what, let's run every 5 minutes from the East Coast and the West Coast. So then what's unique about that is, and so a lot of people today see that like, oh, we have a status page. Your status page is pinging it, and if it returns, it's 100%. That's not what happens. Like, we have a large book publisher in New York City where their endpoints reply at 100%. Their API is always up, but their database goes down. So if you actually look into their payload, it'll say status code 200, A-OK. But then you dive one step deeper, it's empty. They had no idea. Their 99.5% uptime is actually 96, and it's actually been down for the 3 hours today. They didn't know until we actually built tests for them. So that's very specifically like the unique things you get out of doing proper testing. You create a proper test and then run it at every stage, because that one test can actually validate that every part of the company works all together. Like, one example I give often is Etsy. Etsy has about 3,500 items every day that don't have a category associated. It's supposed to have a category associated always. What happened? Well, a team came up with their idea of how to build an API, and they said, like, if there's no category, say not specified. Here's the big issue. The team in charge of actually uploading products, they forgot to require that as a field. It's a totally different team. They just missed one thing, one asterisk. But when you really think about it, it's 3,500 products times $20. That's like $70,000 to $75,000 of the products that disappeared from the website. Because if you go through the navigation team uses the API properly. So you go to men's, it shows all the men's things. There's no section on the thing that says just like no idea. Null. There is no section for null in the homepage navigation. That's the stuff people aren't catching. Like, you don't know what you're missing by not testing for it. And so that's sort of API Fortress. That is it. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but we did our best. Thank you. I guess I'm going to wait for questions. Anyone? Yes, sir.
Do you have notions of written requirements about coverage and things like that when you're doing the testing? How do you come up with these nightmarish scenarios? Do you have rules of thumb? Do you have an experience base?
Multiple ways. Yes, experience-based. We actually onboard. He's asking like, rules of thumbs and how do we know about some of these things. So we actually onboard a lot of the customers ourselves because it's so quick to build a test. So number one, they often look to us for suggestions. So we'll onboard the API and be like, you really shouldn't be using null here. You shouldn't have a space in the object. Like, we'll come to them with suggestions as we're building it. On top of, we often require them to give us documentation or their blueprint, like their Swagger file. So their Swagger is very specifically the plan as to what it should be. And if it's not as per the plan, then there's an issue there. Either they didn't define it properly, or there's something wrong with the actual delivery of it.
Or the plan itself is faulty.
The plan is often faulty, yes. Yes, sir, question?
Do you guys do cross-integration APIs? So, to give you an example, we do APIs ourselves, we feed SAP, we take SAP's API, and both of us use APIs through a payment gateway for credit card transactions. You guys can do, full logic tests across all three?
Yeah, so he's asking about full integration testing. Yeah, so you can chain as many get calls together as you want. And one interesting thing about the way the platform works is that it actually it generates a test for you, and you could also build it by hand. But the way it generates it is it actually sets you up in a bunch of variables. So if you've ever developed before, you'll recognize these variable calls. And so very specifically, you can make one get call, it gets the whole payload, stores it as a variable, and then you could use that variable in subsequent calls or later on, or you could set it as a new variable. So we have full integration tests. We actually have one example with Atlassian, with Jira, creates a ticket, edits it, updates it, and at the very end, after 16 steps, it closes it. And the whole thing works by pushing a button, and it doesn't create a ticket that you don't need. Any other question? Yes? Business model is ad hoc. It's literally every customer is different, because our entire platform can either be in the cloud or it could be fully on premises. If it's in the cloud, we have to limit how many tests, how many times you can run it, how many users. If it's on premises, we get more lenient with all those things. If you need both, etc. So we're one of those, I hate it, I never wanted to be this guy, but we're one of those companies with a pricing page that says, call us. But I literally have no choice, because I have a customer that just asked us for a price. They said we might need 300 users, but we only need 20 tests. How the hell does that work? But that's how they work. It's single sign-on. They have a bunch of analysts, and we've never dealt with this before. I can't just tell them it's X per user, which we usually price it by, honestly. It's usually seat-based, but with something like that, we have to keep it flexible for that very specific reason. Any other questions? Yes?
So an API platform company like MuleSoft, they don't provide any sort of testing capability?
No, and that's sort of he's asking about MuleSoft or an API manager. Apogee, MuleSoft, TIBCO Mashery, Axway, WSO, blah, blah, blah. So very specifically, they don't. And when we thought about this idea in 2013, a lot of our friends that used to work with us at UsableNet actually moved on to those companies. And so we asked them, you guys must have this on the roadmap. And they didn't. We're well, what point? One of our advisors is actually the product manager at Mashery, and he had been talking to us for years. And he was I love it, but we just don't have time for this on the roadmap. So he's we need to just throw it in there, but we just don't have time. So that's why we committed to this, because the reality is that API Fortress was created by two old men, relatively speaking. My co-founder and I are both in their mid-30s. We both own homes, and we don't get Snapchat. So we would never quit our jobs to make goddamn Snapchat. I still don't get it. So what we said is what's the dullest B2B SaaS thing you could think of that actually needs and actually has business? Is there anything duller, and is there anything that needs disruption more than this? I don't think so. So this is what we committed to, because that's all we build. We build B2B SaaS. That's what we've been doing our whole careers, and that's what we're focused on right now. Any other questions? Okay, bye.